couple months ago, my friend and I were having a debate about the Lego Batman movie. One of us was saying that it sucked, while the other really liked it. That second person was me, of course, because the Lego Batman movie rocks. While arguing, we went over the typical things you talk about while debating a movie, like the story, the characters, the comedy, and the awesome action sequences. But eventually we seemed to reach a barrier where neither of us could agree with each other on the quality of the movie. Finally, I pulled up the Rotten Tomatoes score of 90% to prove that I was right. Normally we would regard this as a win, but what did that actually do? Even though it made me feel better, he didn't end up loving the movie afterwards. This is just a glimpse into the hundreds of daily scenarios in which we find ourselves with the oddity of opinions. You see, people are really cool, because unlike pretty much every other living being, we don't spend our day-to-day lives just trying to survive. We can spend our time arguing online about a movie that just came out, or the flaws in a game's design. Opinions are especially rampant in the world of entertainment because the entire idea of songs, movies, and video games are made so that they are good. Except everyone has a different perception of what good is. Today I want to dive into how opinions shape these spaces and how people are the weirdest species ever. Firstly, I think we have to address how controversial expressing a take is on any sort of media. The joy of opinions is that there's always going to be someone who likes a thing, someone who doesn't, and someone in between. There's an infinite amount of them. The issue that arises from this is how far our conversations about them have strayed from nuance. In the age of social media, you don't see people long enough to have a meaningful discussion about something. You'll probably tweet about how you like the new Planet of the Apes movie, and someone who didn't like will see that and just comment, "Fuck you, it was terrible." And maybe they'll go back and comment, "Well, what about it didn't you like?" And the other person will say, "Everything about it was bad, and that's about it." Social media allows people who suck to just go around shitting on people's opinions just because they're not the same as their own. And this creates the culture of opinions that people take so personally. A large majority of people will take it to heart if you don't like something they like, and act like you killed their dog. As if it's such a crazy notion that someone thought differently than you did. Social media allows an environment in which people can hide behind a PFP, and you don't have to respond to someone's comment. Not having to respond is nice when someone is being totally out of line, but it also stops people from being held accountable for stuff. Like if you want to steer a hateful comment into a meaningful discussion about why they felt the way they do about something, they can just ignore it completely. All of this makes it so that it's essential that you are radical about everything, because you don't have a lot of time to explain how you really feel. Either you love something, or you hate it. No in between. When in reality, that's not how opinions work. You can see the good and bad in stuff, even if it's something you feel strongly about. But this doesn't usually happen, and these radical lovers and haters create groups and communities that ultimately affect how other people view the creation. This is how other people's opinions can affect our own. A good example of this for me is Ghost of Tsushima. When I first beat it a couple months ago, I thought it was pretty good. The combat is fun and the graphics are gorgeous, but all in all, it was an okay experience and a pretty basic open world game. Then I got on Twitter and saw how much people loved it. And at first it was okay. I was happy that people had such an appreciation for something that the developers obviously put a lot of time and love into. And then I saw the people calling it masterpieces, and how it's the best game ever, and how it should have won Game of the Year. And with each tweet I found myself despising the game more and more. And then for a game I once didn't really care about, I find myself replying to these takes with stronger versions of my own thoughts. Granted, they were still respectful and open to discussion, because I wanted to see why people love this game so much, but I was never this passionate about it before. These groups can radicalize other opinions through their own, and even though I see what it's done to me, I'm still making a review of it out of spite, so look forward to it. The funny thing is that Ghost of Tsushima doesn't even have a notoriously toxic community. Now, take this situation and apply it to groups like Swifties and the Snyder Cult, both of which always proclaim that everyone else is out to get them and that they're all dumb for not understanding what the artist is trying to say. When in reality, both Taylor Swift and Zack Snyder are good at what they do, for the most part. Yet these support groups inadvertently create hate communities through their love of someone who may or may not deserve it. And it's not only for people who love things so much. The opposite can also happen. Take The Last of Us Part 2. This was the most controversial game to ever release, and when it did, there were so many people who absolutely hated it. People who were transphobic, sexist, homophobic, people who didn't even play it and already formed their opinion, people who just hated on it for the sake of hating. There was so much irrational hate towards this game that it caused the people who might have just liked the game before to love it, making them defend the game tooth and nail against all sort of crazy claims. This painted the narrative that there were two camps of fans for The Last of Us Part 2. The vengeful haters and the crazy fanatics, when in reality only one of those groups exists to that degree. Of course there are fanatics, but nothing like what was being depicted. And the biggest issue with the whole situation is that it buries any room for a good discussion. Any genuine compliment and criticism was being written off as either blind loving or hating, when that's not the case at all. It's so hard to have a real conversation about something when it's expected that you are in one of the two groups. The Last of Us Part 2 controversy also showcased one of the biggest ever examples of the next topic, which is people's hate for journalists. More specifically, reviewers. Now, obviously, there's more to journalism than just doing reviews on upcoming media, but that's the part people hate on the most. Being a professional critic is funny because it's one of the only professions that relies completely on just expressing your opinion. The way this becomes controversial is that not everyone will agree with the review, obviously. Their job is just to report on how they thought of something. But then the people who didn't agree with them bring into question why they are getting paid to express their opinion while everyone else does it for free. What most people seem to forget is that these reviewers aren't getting paid the big bucks. The only reason they be in this position is because they love what they do. But typically people seem to think that reviewers see themselves as above everyone else because of their position, when in reality, they're where they are because they did this for years without getting paid and worked hard for their position. Although, whenever a reviewer publishes an opinion that the general public doesn't agree with, there's always some who call to tear down the reviewing industry. This is seen most often in gaming, especially with IGN. It's become increasingly popular to make fun of IGN's reviews every time they might have missed the mark. But everyone seems to forget that whatever number they show at the end of the review isn't some end-all be-all. It's just one guy's opinion on a popular website. This isn't to say these gaming outlets are bulletproof though. There are plenty of valid reasons to be upset with how they work. One of the biggest issues is that it's a dice roll on who reviews a game on IGN. Every review is from a different person's perspective, so if you go back and look at them, they're all wildly inconsistent. Sometimes you might get a review from a guy who loves the series, and sometimes you might get it from one guy who hates it. Consistency is the power of a critic. After seeing so many of one person's reviews, you'll start to see what they lean towards and what they struggle to tolerate. And as a reviewer, it's imperative that you understand these things yourself. What kind of critic are you? What are your shortcomings? For me, I'm a lot less forgiving when it comes to older games, more specifically the habits they carry, like a shallow story, clunky gameplay, and constant bullshit. Once you see so many of my reviews, you'll start to understand my appreciation towards aggressive combat and well-written and acted characters. Even if you don't always see eye to eye with the reviewer, their opinion still holds weight if you know what usually interests them. When reviewing, it's also important to understand your personal bias. I'm a big PlayStation guy. I'm going to have more tolerance for the beginning of a title if it's made by PlayStation Studios than Xbox. The final score will still be representative of what I think about it, but at the start, I'll be rooting for one more than the other. It's also important as a consumer to know the difference between bias and preference. When I was born into this world, I was not a Sony fan. Believe it or not, I wasn't even a gamer. The first console I had was an Xbox 360 and I loved it. But over time, as I played more games with both and developed my preference, I found that PlayStation offered a lot more of the type of games I enjoy. Therefore, I'm more loyal to their brand. All these things like bias, preference, and perspective, no matter how sound, will all be used against a critic to prove that they're bad. But what makes a good critic? Is that even possible? Some would say that all reviewers should look at everything objectively to give a fair point of view, which on paper sounds like a good solution, but ultimately this wouldn't work. Not only is that super boring, but subjectivity will always find its way in no matter what. Different people could have different ideas on what something's objective quality is. The closest I can get to analyze the objective quality of something is to measure what they intended on doing to what the final product is. Too many people mix up something bad with something being not for them too often, and I think this is important when reviewing anything. You have to take into consideration the target audience. To give you an example, take Baldur's Gate 3 and Ghost of Tsushima again. Both are games I'm not a huge fan of, but I look at them in different ways. When it comes to Baldur's Gate, I find a lot of personal problems with the combat and storytelling, but a lot of it revolves around the genre. The people who take interest in that type of layout find it to be really well made, so I understood it as me just not being a fan of that style of game. Whereas Ghost of Tsushima feels like it was made for me, an expansive open world Japanese samurai game, yet I find a lot of issues with how it handles most aspects. I'm less forgiving with the title that had me as its target audience because I think it fell short on what it was trying to achieve. Despite having a handle on how to look at things objectively, a lot of people may think differently. So I think the best case that can be made for a good viewer is someone who just has the most basic of opinions. It's the only way to keep the majority of people happy. Take Moist Critical for instance. I love the guy, but I could put my life in what he'll think about an upcoming movie and be confident that I'll survive. This isn't a bad or good thing, and it's clearly represented by his large audience. When a movie or game drops, you know Critical is going to have the same opinion on it that you've seen 100 times elsewhere. This is certainly boring because the tension is lost, but it's also good to have someone in your video circle who you'll agree with most of the time. But is he a good critic? The answer to that is... there is no answer, obviously. As much as people would like to make you believe, there is no such thing as a good opinion. And that's largely the issue with all this radical discourse about everything, especially revolving around the credibility of a critic. As if a reviewer needs to get fired from the outlet if they're consistently against the general public's perception of a game or movie. There's not a scale of quality of an opinion. And while this is true, I think that many people hear this and misconstrue it to mean that nobody's allowed to disagree with each other, which obviously isn't the case. Let's take it back to my story about the Lego Batman movie. My friend and I both disagreed heavily on most aspects of the film, but we didn't take it personally. We didn't get pissed off at each other, we just presented our claims to each other, and when we found that we just had a different perception of what a good Lego Batman movie was, we stopped talking about it. And that's the biggest thing when it comes to opinions online. People forget about perception. We are all different people with different life experiences. Every human is unique in its own way, and these experiences shift how we judge media. Preference, bias, nostalgia, how we grew up, the friends we've had. If you've had a parent who's died, you're going to have more emotional susceptibility to a character who has as well. If you had a certain song playing around the house a lot when you were a kid, it's going to have a special place in your heart. If you have a good memory somewhere and a place in a movie reminds you of that place, you're going to feel something. All this shapes who we are and what we like. A lot of it we don't fully understand, and that's okay. We don't have to understand why we like what we like, but what we need to do is understand that not everyone will. If you see someone that disagrees with you, ask why, and maybe you'll find a lot of what they have to say interesting. At the very least, you learn something about them. An opinion is more than how we feel about something. It connects us to each other. It's how we make friends. When you get together with people, you bond about what you like and don't like. It opens people up. Whether you're at school, work, a friend's house, or a family gathering, you're talking about how you feel. That's all an opinion is. Telling someone how you feel. It's that expressiveness that allows us to come together and grow. Opinions are weird, but they're also so beautiful. It gives you a look inside of someone, and that's what this is all about, right? We're all just trying to get a little closer.